I'd like to start by thanking everyone for coming despite Storm Imogen's best efforts. And I'd like to thank Craig Enser and Nadia O'Reilly and David for providing this venue and organising everything. First of all, I'd better say to you, I have never actually done a PowerPoint presentation before because I live in a very small Cappadocian village where we don't actually have the necessary things to do it. So I've practiced this on a TV, but not on an actual PowerPoint presentation. My name is Pat Yale. I live in Turkey. I've been writing about Turkey for 25 years, on and off, mostly on guidebooks. I live in one of the cave houses in Cappadocia. I've been living there now for 15 years, despite leaks and many other problems, and I'm about to move to Istanbul. But I don't want to talk a lot about me. We're here to talk about Gertrude Bell, and I'm hoping that most people will by now have looked on Wikipedia, if they didn't know who Gertrude Bell already was, to find out a little about her life. This is Gertrude when she was young. She was born in Washington, in what was County Durham, but is now Tyne and Wear. She's best known for her travels in the Middle East. And if people do know about her, they usually know about her in terms of helping to create what was Syria and Iraq, for travelling in Saudi Arabia, for travelling in Palestine. She's the author of several books. Two of them are specifically about Turkey, about the churches of Turkey, around a place called Binbir Kilise in Karaman, in the centre of Turkey, and about the Tur Abdin, which is around Midyat in southeastern Turkey. In addition to that, there are also three of her books that are partially about Turkey. Despite its title, Persian Pictures is partly about Turkey. So is The Desert and the Somme, so is Amurath to Amurath. I've written here that she visited Turkey on at least 8 occasions. This is because while I've read her diaries and her letters in preparation for my journey that I was about to make, there are some references in her biography that suggest other visits that I can't actually find the documentation for. So I'm sure she visited 8 times. It's possible that she visited 9 or 10 times between 1889 and 1914. As far as I know, she did not go back after the First World War. And she died in Baghdad in 1926. Now, I am only interested in the part of her life before the First World War, when she was a young woman travelling in Turkey, mainly an archaeologist, a writer, an explorer. Turks will say a spy. I would contest that she was a spy when she was young, even if she was when she was older. What I discovered was that if you look at the biographies, she had such a fantastic life that it's very difficult to condense it into a 1-volume biography. This is a woman who was the first woman to be awarded a first in modern history at Oxford when women weren't even given their degrees. She was a mountaineer who has a mountain named after her. She's written a number of books. She's done all this travelling. She was very important in the period after the war, particularly with helping King Faisal, who became the first king of Iraq, to learn the kingship. But I think what that has meant is that the first part of her life, the young part of her life, when she spent a lot of time in Turkey, has been effectively overlooked. Seems surprising. But as I say, if you look in the biographies, you find very little. Fortunately for us, Newcastle University very kindly put all her diaries and all her letters online, and so I was able to work out where she had been. Now I'm going to start by showing you, I hope, how I came up with the idea of following her journeys around Turkey. It's a very unpromising situation. It was a day when I'd just been bitten by a golden retriever and had spent most of the day faffing about trying to get rabies injections. And at the very end of the afternoon, I thought, well, I've got half an hour left. I'll pop in onto this exhibition in Istanbul about Nazlı's guest book. Now, Nazlı was the daughter of Osman Hamdi Bey, who is an artist. He founded the Istanbul Archaeology Museum, and he excavated at Nemrut Dağ, where some of you will know the huge heads on the top of the mountains. His daughter kept a visitor's book, and when I was looking around at these entries, I suddenly saw this entry by Gertrude Bell. The most exalted seat in the world is the saddle of a swift horse, and the best companion for all time is a book. And what struck me immediately was that firstly, I didn't know that she'd ever been to Istanbul, which possibly is my fault. But secondly, that rather implied that she had more than just passingly visited. If she actually knew Osman Hamdi Bey and had actually been to his house, that rather suggested more than a passing acquaintance. Shortly after that, I went to visit this church in the western side of Cappadocia at Aksaray. This is the Canlı Kilise. Cappadocia is mostly known for its cave churches, but there are one or two of these built churches that get very little attention compared to the cave ones. And as you can see, this is a magnificent church, despite its ruinous state. And when I was researching into this church, I came upon Gertrude saying that she was only going to have 3 hours to look around this church. And I'd come by taxi, so I was thinking, well, I'll be lucky if I get 3/4 of an hour out of a youthful taxi driver who's never seen this church in his life and would have no idea why I even wanted to come. So that was the second stage, and it made me think that...
You just point at the computer. It usually works.
Sorry. It made me think that it was at least worth looking into the story of Gertrude Bell in Turkey. So I sent away for the book that she wrote about Binbir Kilise, and in it I came across this very strange looking building that started life as a Byzantine church, was turned into a mosque, and then had a clock tower added onto the top of it. Now, I thought I knew Konya very well, and I had never seen or heard of this church before. So I went onto Twitter and said, can anybody tell me anything about this church? And back came somebody saying it was blown up in 1921, presumably during the Turkish War of Independence. But at that point, I thought, there's definitely a story here, because I think I know Turkey pretty well, and I didn't know any of this. So then I went to read her diaries, and discovered that she had been almost everywhere in Turkey. This is going to be a pain, isn't it, if I can't make it move on? Oh, here we are. Okay. So what I did then was I read through her diaries, I marked onto a map every single place that I could find a reference to her having been. I then joined up all the dots and decided that I would redo that journey. Now, I'm not for 1 minute suggesting she ever made this journey. She didn't. She made a number of different journeys. But I've created one route out of where she went. And she came in the first time into Istanbul, as everybody did, to Constantinople. But she also came in on later occasions into Izmir when it was Smyrna, and travelled right down the coast to Bodrum, then across through the lakes all the way to Konya, and then not necessarily on the same trip. I came all the way down the coast to Silifke, came around here all the way down to Antakya, and then followed right the way around as far as Cizre. The security situation didn't allow me to go to Silopi. That was the only place that I actually failed to get to. And then I came back through Batman, Hasankeyf, Diyarbakir, all the way around through here, back to Konya, where she would have taken the train up through Eskişehir and back to Istanbul. So that's the journey I did. I thought it would take 3 months, it took 7. And I still haven't totally finished because I never went to Silopi. So this is where it all starts. Some of you, I mean most of you will know this, the Sirkeçi station, the starting point for the Orient Express. Interesting because at that time it was very new when she first came there in 1889, and now it's effectively redundant because since the Marmaray opened and the train service to Greece stopped, in effect there's no function anymore for the Sirkeçi station. Its future is still a little uncertain. It will probably be turned into a lot of cafes and restaurants, probably.
Shopping mall.
A shopping mall, yes. I mean, I wouldn't mind it being a hotel, but...
That'd be great.
Yeah, sorry. All of you will know this, the interior of Hagia Sophia, Hagia Sophia. The first time that Gertrude visited it in 1889, it was Ramazan, and it was still a mosque in those days. And she went on the night of power and watched all the people praying all night because it was the most sacred night of the year. Now, I don't want to linger on Istanbul because I do think that people know quite a lot about Istanbul. This is just showing, she used to come by steamer from Marseille into what was Smyrna and is now Izmir. So this is just a picture to indicate arriving by boat, although that's obviously the ferry rather than the ship she came on. This is to give you an idea of what Smyrna looked like in those days. I mean, people, those of you who know Turkey well, will know that now it's a very big modern city. It doesn't look anything like the pearl of the Aegean that it was at that time. when there were large stone buildings all the way along the waterfront. The big building in the middle is the Grand Kramer Hotel. Gertrude stayed at the Hotel de Ville, which was somewhere nearby. But as most of you who know the history of Turkey will know, in 1922, fire whipped right the way along the whole of this cordon and destroyed all these buildings, and her hotel went up with all the other hotels. So I could only pinpoint roughly where she stayed and not exactly. There are some little bits of buildings left so that you can get some little bit of an idea of what that whole waterfront would have looked like, but mostly now they've been added to, built on, not so beautiful as they would have been. But it didn't really matter terribly much, because Gertrude, in her many visits, she spent in total about a month in and around Izmir. And most of the time, she didn't stay in a hotel. She stayed in the suburb, what was then Bornabat, which is now a suburb of Izmir. It's the Bornova suburb, mostly full of buildings owned by the Aegean University. So this is me arriving in Wisteria season, in front of a building which I wasn't able to get into, but where Liszt taught the young woman who was living there to play the piano, and where Ataturk visited and stayed during the Turkish War of Independence. This building, however, is where she stayed. You have to imagine this building without the two flanking buildings. Just imagine the centre part with the big steps going up. This was a building called Büyükev, the big house. And it belonged to a family called the Whittles, who were British in origin. They were a Levantine family, what is called a Levantine family. They had been there since the beginning of the 19th century, and they were massively wealthy traders and owned lots and lots of property, and were the centre of Bornova society. And right next door is this little piece of England that I was lucky enough to see with Craig. This also originally belonged to a member of the Whittle family, and a man called Edward, who cultivated tulips, and one of the tulips is actually named after him. These families were all very interrelated and intermarried, and this particular house is still owned by a Levantine family called the Giroux, and they rented out for a wedding venue. But there's nothing from the outside. When you're walking along the street, you just see this blank wall with this little tiny door, so you've no idea that when you enter, that's what you're going to see. And I know for sure that Gertrude was in this garden. So for me, the day that I came into this garden with Craig, who organised this event, I knew that I could leave Smyrna because I had definitely found a place that Gertrude was in. The other place that she stayed in was a farm, which it appears has been drowned by a dam. It's not 100% positive, but as far as I could find out on the site, it seemed to be the case. While in Izmir, Smyrna, Gertrude made many side trips, and this one, as you obviously can all see, is to Ephesus. I'll be honest, I arrived in Ephesus in April on a public holiday, and I completely flunked it. I just thought, I've been to Ephesus any number of times, I simply cannot bring myself to go there on a day when on top of all the cruise people and all the normal people, there will also be all the holidaying people. So what I decided to do was, instead of going into Ephesus, I would walk along the wall that surrounds it, which Gertrude had done. So someone dropped me off at the start of the wall, and he described to me the walk, and he said, you know, you'll be walking along, and then you'll come to a stretch where the wall has fallen down. And sure enough, I came to a stretch where the wall had fallen down, and I climbed over it, and when I got to the other side, I couldn't find the path. I couldn't remember what he'd said to me. I couldn't remember if he said go down the other side of the wall. I wandered around. I thought, well, I can't find the path, I'll have to go back. By then, I couldn't find the path back either. There was a howling wind so strong that when I tried to go on the other side of the wall, I actually thought I might be blown over. It was worse than today. And the day was getting on, and it was April, so obviously the day is not very long in April. So I was sitting on this wall thinking, I don't know what I'm going to do. If I don't do something soon, I'm going to have to call the emergency services, which will be so embarrassing. So in the end, and I've never done this in my life before, I had to phone the man who had kindly dropped me off at the start of the wall and say, well, that's good, I'm lost, I can't find the way forward, I can't find the way back, I don't know what I'm going to do. and he came out and rescued me. And only then did I reread Gertrude's diary, where she clearly only walked half the wall herself, and I'm thinking, I assumed she did that because she was catching the train back to Smyrna. But just as likely, when she got to the part where it had all fallen down, her guide would have said to her, and that is as far as we can go. But I wasn't so sensible. So clearly, she went to very well-known places like Ephesus, but she also went to places that nobody goes to anymore. Now, this is Bloundos. This is somewhere near Ushak. And no one in Ushak knew where it was. You know, it was one of these things where I was having to say to the taxi driver, well, I know it's near Suleymaniye, so if we just keep following the signs for Suleymaniye, we will find it. Very little information. Gertrude herself says, I know nothing more than what I saw at the site. It appears to be a very old site because it's very, very simple. Beautifully located, absolutely gorgeous location. Probably still nobody's been there since I visited. So. And this is a slightly more visited site, but not much more. This is Lagina. This is the only temple of Hecate that's ever been excavated in Turkey, and it was excavated by Osman Hamdi Bey. Beautiful setting, absolutely gorgeous, just down the road from a power station. I've never seen anybody there. But she went there and she stayed the night. And this is one of my favourite ruins in Turkey. This is a site called Stratonikeia, which was also the village of Eski Hisar. So what happened here was that the village grew up actually on the site of the ruins. So the houses were actually built using the materials from the walls, and you can see here, you know, a column built into the walls. In 1982, they opened a lignite quarry nearby, and all the villagers were relocated to a very ugly Yeni Eski Hisar. And then this was left behind. I've never seen anyone here either. However, on this most recent village visit, they were preparing it for tourism. They were building a ticket office. They were improving the parking facilities. So I presume that in the future it will be visited. It's a very, very beautiful site. It's one of the rare places where you can walk on Ottoman streets, but you're also looking at an archaeological site. Okay, so Konya, we all know for the whirling dervishes. Sorry, it's a real nuisance. I can't remember. And we also know it for the shrine of the Mevlana, which she obviously went to see. She went to see all the sites here, but the most important thing about Konya in terms of the story of Gertrude Bell is that it's here that she met Dick Doughty Wiley, who was the love of her life. He was the consul in Konya at the time, and he was married to this woman Lillian. I think he looks very spivvy myself. I think he looks like someone I wouldn't trust further than I can see him. And the only other photos I've got of him, he looks a very dull, sort of, you know, solid older man. So, but I mean, I presume that their romance was mainly based on intellectual commonality. It's a sad story. He was married. There's never any suggestion that he would ever have left his wife, I don't think. So despite the fact that it was a slow burn romance that got much stronger as the years went by, I don't know that it would have had any future. In any case, he was killed at Gallipoli. So that was, I feel that that sort of divided her life and explains partly why she probably didn't go back to Turkey. He's buried at Gallipoli. I was not able, Konya is a little bit frustrating from my point of view, I was not able either to find the hotel she stayed at. I desperately wanted it to be this one because it's such a beautiful building and because it's called the Baghdad Hotel, so it should be where she stayed. It's exactly opposite the train station, but it's 1912, so it's wrong. She was there in 1907. So unless there was something, I don't know whether it was improved in 1912, I didn't find where she stayed. And I also, more surprisingly, couldn't find the consulate either. There were 5 consulates. The French one still survives, I found that. The Russian one, there are photographs that I saw. The British one, no one had any idea at all where it was. Nobody has been able to identify for me where it was. So in the end, failing all that, I found the general area where it would have been, and I found this lovely old crumbling Ottoman building with roses, and I told myself she would have met Doughty Wiley in something wonderful and romantic like this with roses. So it's not true, but that's what I told myself, and then I moved on. I've put in a few pictures of what's around Konya because I think people don't necessarily know how much there is around Konya. And this is interesting because this is a Byzantine church in a village nearby called Sille, which reminds me of a Cotswold village. And people with agendas, let's say, are often very keen in Turkey of saying, oh, they restore all the mosques, they never do anything about the Christian and Jewish heritage. And it actually just isn't true. So this is a Byzantine church that has just been beautifully restored. As you can see, they've spent years doing that, because I've seen it over the years. And the good news is that it was being very visited by people from Konya who were very interested. It was quite a crowd in there. And then also nearby is this is Kalistra, which may or may not have been visited by St. Paul. It's another rock-cut settlement, rather like Cappadocia, but here we have a church that's been totally cut out of the rock, which is a very impressive thing to see. And she stayed here in a cave somewhere that she accessed via the roof. But of course, there's no way, I mean, you know, I went and looked at a number of caves, but you can't say conclusively, this is the cave she stayed in. I couldn't do that. The subtitle, for those who know me well, know that the subtitle for this book ought to be Travels with Taxi Drivers, because I spent a lot of time with taxi drivers. I'm very pleased recently I discovered that so did Freya Stark, so that made me feel a lot better, actually. So this is Bimbia Kalise, about which Gertrude wrote one of her books with Sir Professor William Ramsay. So I've arrived here with my taxi, and we're in front of this building here, which they always say its function is not known. But I have to say that after spending a lot of time over in the Tur Abdin, where every church has something like this in the courtyard, I'm fairly sure that this was probably used in the summer for summer services, because in the Tur Abdin, these standalone arches are used for that. When it's too hot to go inside the church, you pray outside, which is also true of mosques. There are outdoor mosques as well, namazgahs. So I personally am fairly sure that's what that might have been. People will have mixed views about this. Bimbia Kalise is a very large site, and it has two parts, a lower and an upper part. The lower part was a living village until recently, but the government have now moved all the villagers out with the intention of being able to excavate properly. Now, I know that that is good in some ways, but I personally like it when sites continue to be occupied. I love to see the chicken beside the old piece of Byzantine masonry, and I think something is lost when you move all the people out. But then on the other hand, you can also excavate, so it swings and roundabouts. And what they're doing is clearing the churches out, and they're doing a very good job. Gertrude did much the same thing back at the start of the 20th century. She didn't have permission to actually excavate, to actually dig. She had permission to clear. So she spent 6 weeks at Bimbia Kalise clearing the rubble and the overgrown grass and stuff out of these churches. But over the 100 years since then, it had all accumulated again. And so what they're doing now is clearing it all out, and I was very impressed actually by what they've done. I thought that it made it much easier to see the site. They're obviously very fine churches there. Those who know Turkish know that Bimbia Kalise means 1,001 churches. There are not 1,001 churches, of course, that's just an exaggerated phrase, but there are a lot. So say there's 6 that are still standing on the top of the hillside. Why they're so close together, I really don't know. I haven't found that out yet. I will do, I'm sure. I'm sorry about the jumping around. It's because you can't condense 7 months very easily into 3/4 of an hour, so you have to miss bits out. But you will be able to read them in my book in the future. This is Kızılesi down on the south coast, and this is standing in the castle that's on the land, looking over at the castle after which Kızılesi is named, Maiden Castle, out in the water. Unfortunately, a lot of restoration in Turkey, as people will know, is not of the best, and what they've done to the island castle is not particularly impressive, so it looks now much more impressive from a distance than it does close up. They've installed masses of electric lighting and so on that rather detracts from its authenticity. But at Kızılesi, just by the roadside, there's a big main road, and just inland from the road you can see this statue, this tomb carving with a soldier on it. And when I was doing the original research, what really struck me is that you can identify from her diary so precisely what she saw. The road is just behind me, edged by a wall of rock-cut tombs, on one of which is a warrior cut in relief, and it's still there to this day, which I find that very moving. If you were going along this coast road that some of you will know, there's a busy main road now, And just inland on the right-hand side, you can see up on the skyline these huge buildings, none of which had I ever bothered to look at before. But on this particular trip, because Gertrude had been to them, I scrambled up and went to look. And this is just one of a string of very large churches and monasteries in a line. You can walk between them on a Roman road, and you come across a necropolis, a very large necropolis with all sorts of tombs just scattered around. Absolutely nobody there. Very romantic place to be. I presume in time all this will be cleaned up and also opened to tourism. Skipping hastily on again, this is a picture that was taken at the site of Carchemish, which is a very interesting archaeological site for a number of reasons. This is where Gertrude Bell met Lawrence of Arabia. He was an archaeologist working at this site from 1911 to 1914. But the trouble with this site is it actually straddles the Syrian border. So 1/3 of it is in Syria and 2/3 of it is in Turkey. As a result, it's always been a military zone. It's never, in my times in Turkey, been accessible as a general run-of-the-mill thing to do. And it still isn't now. But astonishingly, given the situation, Italian archaeologists started excavating again in 2011 and have continued. And as far as I know, will continue this summer, in spite of the fact that ISIS is 1 kilometre away across the border, and they did tell me that they actually had to duck down because bullets were coming over, and they had to stop doing the south gate because it was too dangerous. Anyway, I was not allowed to go to the site. I couldn't be given permission, but I was allowed to stay the night with the archaeologists. So during the day when they were off busy excavating, I was here with some Syrian refugees washing pots during the day. This is Hittite pottery we're washing there. But the particularly amazing thing from my point of view is that one of the archaeologists has been assigned to dig up the dig hut that was used in 1911 to 1914, which would have been where Lawrence of Arabia lived and where presumably he met Gertrude. So I found that very moving, and I'm still angling to try and go this summer. Whether they will let me, whether the situation will allow, I don't know, but I'm still hoping. But they've done a 3D computer simulation, so I was able to walk through it on a computer. So because of the situation, because of the deteriorating situation in Turkey, I actually went in 1914, before I started the main journey, in 2014. Sorry, I'm living in the early 20th century now. Just before I started the main trip, I went down to Carchemish in case it became even less accessible. And then I went on from there to Suruç, from Urfa. This is the standard, I think, image of Urfa. Absolutely beautiful place that I really love. I think it's the most colourful of the towns in the southeast of Turkey. Not necessarily the easiest place, but the most colourful. The problem was that by the time I got there, because I had thought it would take 3 months and it took much longer, by the time I got there it was Ramazan and it was 45 degrees and people were fasting for 17 hours in the day. So on day 2 it was obvious to me that I couldn't continue because I couldn't talk to anyone. You can't talk to someone at 10 o'clock in the morning who can't have a glass of water until 8:30 at night when it's 45-degree temperatures. So I couldn't go home, so I had to hang around for a bit. And I saw a wonderful alternative side to Urfa. This is the Hasan Pasha Jami, which always has this lovely stream running through the front of it. And normally that's how it is. There's a lovely stream running through it. It doesn't have any people sitting in it. But in Ramazan, when it's 45 degrees, what I discovered was that everybody came here, particularly as the day wore on. So by the end of the afternoon, you had the men sitting at this end with their trousers rolled up, and the children swimming down the other end. And it was a rather wonderful thing to see. And there were several other places like that in Urfa. So although in one way it was disappointing because I had to stop, in another way it was wonderful to have seen. And those of you who know, most of you know Turkey, this is an organised iftar for breaking the fast in the evening, where the various organisations, in this case the local authority, lay on food for everybody. Other groups were doing it around town as well. Some people will recognise this as being Dara, near Mardin, where there's a huge quarry where the stones that built the beautiful buildings of Mardin came from. This is the large necropolis there that's recently been cleaned up again, preparatory to opening it for tourism. But when I came back, when I left Urfa in the start of July, the only problems were excessive heat and Ramazan. By the time I came back 2 months later, the security situation had drastically deteriorated, so there was not another tourist. Every hotel was empty. Just tourism had ceased. So although they've prepared this for tourism, there was never going to be anybody there. In Dara, I met this man, Hamza Kaya. He was one of 2 people I met who, when I told them what I was doing, said to me, "Oh, my grandfather guided Gertrude." Now, I think he may mean his great-grandfather. I think that's more likely. But either way, it doesn't matter. Which is obviously was very moving for me to meet people who had that direct contact. This is the Turabdin, the second area that she wrote a book about. This is probably the finest church in the Turabdin. This is the church at Anutlu, or Ha, depending on how you want to call it. This is also a place where I met someone who said my grandfather had guided Gertrude. Gertrude was robbed here. In the night, someone came to the tent and took her saddlebags, which contained all the notes that she'd had. At that point, she was coming from Syria and Iraq, so all her notes got stolen. Now, Gertrude was a very forthright person, and she wasn't going to settle for being robbed. She made a huge song and dance. She complained to the Vali and all sorts of people. So the pandemonium broke out, and in the end, everything was recovered except the actual cash. So she got her notes back, but it would have been a disaster. She'd have lost, as we all know, what a disaster it is if you lose everything. This is one of the villages in the Turabdin, and these are the last 2 Syrian people there, Syrian Orthodox Christians. The last time I'd gone there, there'd been 3, so we're now down to 2. This is Abdullah and Nishani. Lovely people. Nishani, last time I'd seen her, had been in a very good state of health and had actually climbed into a monastery, climbing over the wall. She was 76, and I was whimpering on the other side saying, "How are you doing that?" And she was saying, "I'm used to it." And then I climbed over, but this time she wasn't fit enough to go. Her husband had to come with me, and this time it was actually unlocked. But you can see on the wall the pictures of all their family who've gone to Sweden. The story of the Syrianis is nothing like as well known as the story of the Armenians, but something fairly similar happened in 1915 to the people of this area. And what was very moving to me was that there was one photograph on the wall, or one picture on the wall, of a Muslim. And I said, "I haven't got this wrong, have I? You are Christians, aren't you?" And they said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, why do you have that picture up there?" And they said that he was a sheikh who, at the time of the killings that occurred, he'd stood up in Batman and said, "This is the wrong thing to do, we should be protecting these people." So even to this day, he's remembered with great reverence for his compassion and humanity and so on. Also, what was interesting about this was the wonderful linguistic mix here. They spoke Syriani to each other, Aramaic, they spoke Arabic to my taxi driver, and they spoke Turkish to me. So that is how the Turabdin is. It's a fascinating place to be linguistically. Although on one occasion, we were looking for a church, and we yelled down to a man, and I knew the name in Syriani, I knew it in Turkish, and I knew it in Arabic. And he shouted up, "Well, don't you know what it is in Kurdish?" Now this, although it's not a very good photograph, gives you an idea. This is the monastery at Mor Algin, which is near Nusaybin. It was the first time I'd ever actually got there. The first time I went there, the road hadn't been completed. It had gone halfway, and I went halfway with the taxi driver, and then unfortunately he told me that we couldn't go any further because the day before someone had stood on a mine and been blown up, and clearly he didn't want to get out and walk up. But this time the road had been completed. The only problem was that the security situation had so deteriorated. It was the only time that I was actually frightened, that I had to go with a taxi driver I didn't entirely trust, that I wouldn't have chosen to go with, and the person who had found him for me in Nusaybin was so aware that that was the situation that he actually sent his son as a kind of hostage, that I would be brought back. So it was a very strange situation to find yourself in. This is the view looking out towards Syria from that monastery. Very, very isolated place with just one priest still there. This is Father Joachim on the right, who's permanently resident there. And on this side, I was very, very lucky. This is Father Dale Johnson, who's the only American Syrian Orthodox priest. And he's an expert on Gertrude Bell and had actually produced a small book about Gertrude and this area. And by then, the Turabdin being small, word had got out that there was a crazy English woman wandering around asking about Gertrude Bell, so he was waiting to meet me. And then we went into the church behind, and while I lit a candle, they said the Lord's Prayer in Aramaic in memory of Gertrude, who was herself, I have to say, an atheist. But it was a wonderful experience. Coming on to Hassan Cave, which I'm sure most people know about, beautiful town on the Tigris that is imminently going to be drowned as a result of a dam project. Again, the various languages, we have it up here in Turkish and Kurdish, and someone at the bottom has written in the Arabic at the bottom. This week there was a fair suggestion that they may be about to actually move the people still living in Hassan Cave into Yeni Hassan Cave, the new settlement which I went and visited. Personally, I think it's a lost cause. There's an American living there who is still clinging to the hope that it can be saved. I've seen the road to the dam, I've seen new Hassan Cave. I don't believe that you spend that money and then you change your mind. I think it's a lost cause. But it's very sad that it should be so. This is a very old photograph because despite the fact that Hassan Cave will be drowned imminently, they are actually restoring this bridge. I mean, it's been ruined for hundreds of years. So why you would restore it now is beyond me, but they are restoring it. So it didn't look like that when I visited. And this is Diyarbakir. I find it quite hard to talk about Diyarbakir at the moment because Diyarbakir has been under siege for more than 2 months, and it's a terrible situation there at the moment. This is the heart of old Diyarbakir, the area that they call Sur, which means walls in Turkish. The tragedy of Diyarbakir is that last June, only last June, the walls of Diyarbakir became a World Heritage Site. And within a matter of months, the security situation there collapsed totally into a situation where most of the middle of the town is empty now. I wonder if the people will ever actually go back. My fear is that I've seen it for the last time, and that what will happen is that the people will not go back, and the interior of the walls will become a fake tourist town. That's what I fear is going to happen. The walls, this is why they would be a World Heritage Site. They're absolutely magnificent. The first part of the walls you saw have been restored. This hasn't. It's very difficult to restore it because there's this vast shanty town in front. Now, I suspect that most of this will have been cleared by the army recently. I really don't know. Nobody can go in to find out what's happened. This was also part of the World Heritage Site listing that was made last year. These are the gardens that stretch from the walls of Diyarbakir right down to the Tigris River. Absolute wonderful sea of greenery. I have no idea what they look like now. This is where Gertrude stabled her horses. This was the Hasan Pasha Han, right in the centre of Old Diyarbakir, which was, until October when I was there at least, it was a thriving breakfasting place, because breakfasting is a big thing in Turkey. But because of the siege, I presume it's empty. I don't know what's happened with it. I did think about riding around. People would say, why did you take taxis? I did think about riding around, but it was things like this that gave me pause, because it's like, yes, Gertrude was able to stable her horses here. Where did I think I was going to stable my horses? I mean, those days are really gone, I think. So I had to make do with the taxis. Oops, sorry. This is the Ulu Jami, very, very important monument in the heart of Old Diyarbakir, that was built on the site of a 4th century church. They've been restoring it. They had been restoring it for the last, I don't know how many years. They were doing a wonderful job. It was a meticulous restoration. You can see everything has been cleaned. They think this might have been a palace originally, or certainly something to do with the church, but you can see the detail has been beautifully restored, and they were months short of finishing when I left last October. And this, I think, also is very, very sad, and Gertrude saw this as well. This is the most interesting heritage development I had seen in Turkey. This is what was the interior castle within the walls of Diyarbakir. And what they'd actually done, and it's such an imaginative project, you just can't imagine, they'd brought the archaeology museum into here, they had brought the city museum into there, they were about to bring the Islamic art museum into there, they'd opened a 3rd century church that's in there, and they'd built a beautiful, you turned one of the buildings into a beautiful trendy cafe. But there was nobody there. I was on my own, and this is before the siege. And I said to a young woman there, this is terrible, I'm the only person here. And she said, well, that's because we're Syria. And I said, well, I think that's an exaggeration. But within a very short space of time, it wasn't quite so much of an exaggeration anymore. So that's very sad. I'm coming to the end now, I'm sure you'll be pleased to hear. And this is, some of you will recognise immediately, the Pera Palace Hotel in Istanbul, which is the only hotel that Gertrude stayed in that is still standing and still functioning as a hotel now. And the hotel were very kind to accommodate me there. But I'm going to finish on a slightly less cheerful note. This is the grave of Doughty Wiley at Gallipoli at Sedlbaya. He died, he was buried where he died. He was shot in the head and he was simply buried on that site. So he's buried all alone. He's the only grave at this particular site. And for me, I personally feel that that was the end of the first half of Gertrude's life. I think that it finished here, and so that is where I would like to finish as well. Thank you. Now, obviously, I skipped over an awful lot of things, so if anybody wants to ask any questions, please feel free.
Is Gertrude buried in Baghdad too?
She's buried in Baghdad, and the last I've heard is that somebody still goes and tends her tomb. I mean, that was about a year ago, but still, the tomb had survived.
The tomb is there.
Yeah, still there, still surviving, despite...
It's there, and recently it's been also cleared and stuff.
Yes, it seems amazing to me
Yeah,
that that
and
could...
it's all these cemeteries, you know, the German one from the World War, and even from Second War, are very well, let's say, very well kept. All people got up.
It's wonderful. It's wonderful
Yeah.
that that's
So
true.
the Indian one, which is very neglected.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
The British Embassy is taking a great interest in her grave.
Oh,
At
good.
the Protestant Cemetery.
Oh, good. Good. Well, I'm pleased to hear that.
You referred to many excavations and restoration projects.
Yes.
Are they being undertaken by Turkish archaeologists and restorative people, or by foreign groups?
Mostly nowadays there's at least a Turkish team working there as well. Very few people can get permission to excavate
Right.
on their own now. The Italian one at Carcamush, I think, is just...
No, they're
Isn't
required
it?
to have
A
a
partner?
Turkish partner
Okay.
of equal status.
Okay, actually, yes, that's true. I remember now the Hittite man was
Son
there.
of
Yes,
Hicker.
yes, that's true. Yes, I forgot that. Yes, so I would say most of them these days are primarily Turkish. That one at Eskihisar, for example, is Seljuk University. I mean, they're doing a very good job.
So, just a question. Gertrude Bell was obviously a very keen archaeologist, but do you know if she was researching anything in particular?
Byzantine churches were the thing that she became most interested in. Because I was following her when she was young, at the beginning she was really little more than a tourist. I mean, when you read her diaries, it's exactly the same as what any of us might have written on our first trips. But then as time goes on, she becomes more and more focused on the Byzantine world and the Byzantine churches and the Byzantine remains. But at the beginning she was just going to visit, as far as I can see, most of the classical sites. And you read in her diaries, I mean, at the beginning, it's all very much about Greek mythology and things like that. But over time, that kind of disappears.
It would have been really unusual to climb up what you did, to climb up the Bulbul down in Ephesus.
Well, she had a horse. She went up by horse,
Aha.
went along and then came back down. And I think it's a common misunderstanding that she was alone. In fact, she was never actually alone. She was usually the only woman and the only Westerner sometimes, but she always had either a guide, she had a manservant who was always there, sometimes she had muleteers. I mean, my mistake was to go up there totally alone and think I would be all right, which was a ridiculous thing to do.
And did she speak Turkish?
No, she started to learn, and she said that of the languages, because she spoke 6 languages, she tried to learn Turkish and she thought it would come quickly, but she said it was the one that didn't stick. So sometimes there are things that are a little unclear, and I think that it could be because if you didn't know Turkish, you were writing down what you thought you heard, and that might not have been quite what was being said. but she was fluent in Arabic.
So how did she pay for all this?
She was an heiress. Her family was one of the six richest families in England. Her grandfather had founded an iron and steel works and a chemical factory. So there was a huge amount of money. By the time of the First World War, it was starting to decline, but basically money wasn't really an issue. Which it obviously was for me. I would not have been staying at the Pera Palace had they not kindly offered to host me there. So.
What specifically drew her to the Middle East in the first place?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, there are curious parallels in our lives, hers and mine. Some of them in the early part. As far as I can see, she'd gone to Bucharest after university. She'd gone to Bucharest because her uncle was the ambassador there, and there she got to know a journalist. And I think he probably suggested that they went on to Constantinople. And then, I mean, the first time I went to Istanbul, it was the rest of the world opened up for me. And, you know, it was the start of the rest of my life. And I had that sort of feeling that it was a bit like that with Gertrude, that she came, she saw it, and she started to fall in love with it. Now, obviously, in the end, it was the real Middle East that completely won her, whereas I stuck with Turkey. But I feel that that's how it happened, almost by chance, really.
Pat, do you mind my mentioning, because I know you're going up to Newcastle, but there was a new exhibit at the Great Northern Museum at Newcastle, which is on until the 3rd of May on Gertrude Bell. So if you want to go on the train, you can learn all about her. She founded the British School of Archaeology in Iraq, which I'm trustee of, which is the Gertrude Bell Memorial.
And she also founded the museum, didn't she? The National Museum.
Yeah. And
I mean,
has done a lot of work on her.
I mean, she was a great overachiever, really. I mean, you know, one of the things that remains for me to do, unfortunately, and I will be attempting to do it fairly soon, she climbed Mount Hassan near Aksaray. And Mount Hassan is a proper mountain. I'm not convinced I can do it. When my friends a few years ago said to me, we're going to climb Mount Hassan, do you want to come? I said, are you joking? And that was the sensible reaction for me. But when I found that she'd done it, then I know that I have to at least attempt it. I find it very hard to imagine I'm going to reach the summit, but who knows? We'll see.
I'm just curious, did you go to Mor Kyriakos monastery in Krada that Gertrude says that she stayed there one night or so, east of Batman? And then from there to the villages she goes to Silvan.
Yes. Well, I did go, unfortunately, to Silvan, which was a very sad experience. Mor Kyriakos, I didn't think she went to Mor Kyriakos, but maybe she did. But I have been there, yes.
Yeah,
I have been there.
And did you do the road from Kyriakos to Silvan?
No.
No.
To be honest, the security situation was so bad. When I got to the bus station in Batman that morning,
This was in October.
Yes,
right?
there was no dolmush for Silvan, which in itself was slightly unusual because there were dolmushes for everyone else. And the atmosphere was very tense. And I was standing there thinking, well, you know, just go with the flow, just sit here for a while. And eventually a dolmush came, and, you know, we got on and off we go. And we're driving along the road, and out of the corner of my eye, I see these guys in full camouflage gear, and I feel the dolmush stopping. And up till then, the very interesting thing was not once had I been stopped. Not once did anybody ask me what I was doing, ask for my ID, nothing, not once. And I thought, okay, we're going to get asked now, get ready to, you know, be a bumbling idiot that doesn't know anything really. And then we didn't stop, we just continued on, and there was a man sitting on a stool beside me, and I said to him, is there a problem? And he said, yes. And I said, what's the problem? And he said, bomb last night. And I said, well, did somebody die? And he said, yes, a soldier died. So I got to Silvan, and, you know, I was chatting to people, and they said, you've come today? And I said, yes. Not yesterday, today? And I said, yes, today. And they said, oh, well, you know, don't go down there, the PKK are down there. So I was sort of walking along and not going down there. But you get into a very strange frame of mind when these things are happening. So they told me not to go down here. So I'm going along the road and I see another turning that way. And Gertrude had described these houses on the walls looking over the gardens at Silvan. And so I looked down there and I thought, well, that looks like where it might have been. I'll go down there. And there was sand right across the road. And I thought, well, is that a blockade? Is that a blockade? Or is that just, because those of you who know Turkey know that a pile of sand could be a pile of sand. So I'm sort of thinking, is that a pile of sand someone just left here, or is it a blockade? So I'm climbing over it, and I walked down the road, and people came out to speak to me. But they were all obviously extremely anxious and didn't, they were all like, what are you doing? It's not a good situation. It's very, very tense. So I came back and I thought, well, I obviously can't stay. I obviously have to go. So I took the bus back, and of course when we came back, on the side of the road we were coming back, there's just this huge hole where the road had been blown out. And of course when I went on to look at the reports in the evening, not just the poor man who they knew had been killed, but collateral damage. Poor man who had a truck with tomatoes had also been killed, and there were tomatoes all over the road. So the situation was not great, really. Anyway, so to an extent I could only go along roads that I thought were fairly... there was another situation where I was in Tur Abdin and I went down to look at a church, and when I came back in the evening there was a message from a friend saying, down that road the PKK are camping. And I sent her back a message saying, oh, well, it's just as well I didn't know that, because obviously I wouldn't have gone down there if I'd known that. And then 2 days later there comes a message saying the government bombed the PKK campment there. So, you were really, running around a very strange situation there.
So how are you going to publish your work?
I have to find a publisher. And this, of course, as anyone would know, is not necessarily the easiest thing. But I'm fairly confident that it's a good story, and that it hasn't been told before, and that therefore eventually I will find a publisher. But how long it will take, I don't know. It particularly doesn't help that I don't live in the UK, so I don't have the contacts. And publishers, they're still living in the 19th century really as regards, they won't deal with you by email, and they won't, you've got to send everything in double line spacing with enclosing your self-addressed envelope for a return and all that.
They're not all that bad.
Anyway, I hope that eventually. I'm concentrating on writing the book now.
How, after all your research and everything, how did you feel about her? Do you think you would have liked her as a person? You described her immense privilege and how, actually, of course, although she talks about I did this, I did that, she had this retinue of people helping her to do all that, and she never got lost because she had guides everywhere. So did you still sort of feel you would have liked her?
That's a very difficult question, because I think she was probably quite like me as a person. So if I say I didn't like her, then what am I saying about myself? I think she was probably someone not everybody would like. I think she was an abrupt person, which is how I am as well, who didn't suffer fools gladly, but she was an incredibly, where we're not the same, she was much cleverer than me and much more accomplished than me. And obviously, she didn't perhaps have to deal with some of those things I had to deal with. But when you read the descriptions, there were no roads in Turkey then, effectively. So, she describes these situations of wading through the mud. And at one point, where I said that I thought the village had probably been drowned, that she stayed in, and I was talking to I got into a routine of going to the village, going to the tea house, finding the oldest looking men there and asking them. And in that particular one, I said about this village and how would she have got here? And he said, oh, the mud up to here, So, she had to contend with all that. She has to have been a very extraordinary person. Whether she was a nice person, possibly not. I don't know. I sometimes think people who achieve things very often aren't actually nice, because you have to be a bit hard to get things done almost. Maybe that's unfair. I don't know.
So another question. Do you think that the experience visiting Anatolia had anything to do later on with her involvement during the First World War? And she is described as a spy sometimes and so on. So what, for instance, I was thinking maybe she was not even welcome in the Ottoman Empire after the war. So how do you think that this was fitting into this?
Well, of course, after the First World War, the Ottoman Empire collapsed.
Yes,
so
that's right. Yes,
she was then working for the British. I don't know. What's interesting is how modern Turks react to her. Most people either haven't heard of her, or if they have heard of her, they immediately say jasus, which means to spy. And there was one incident that occurred where a man had said this in Urfa. He said to me, "Oh, jasus," And I said, well, I don't think she was a jazzist when she came to Urfa. I think she was just looking round. And he was so upset that he had insulted me by saying that my compatriot was a spy, that he was busy sort of saying, oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean it was a joke. And I was so busy trying to comfort him and console him that I wasn't offended, that he had some award sitting on his desk like this, and I threw my arm around, knocked the award on the floor, and it broke into 1,000 pieces. So then he was saying, oh, it doesn't matter, I have many more. You know, it all turned into a bit of an incident, but that's how she's perceived in Turkey. I mean, it worried me a little bit that she was seen like that, because I thought, you know, if I was to say in the southeast, in this rather tense situation, that I'm pursuing a person who's perceived as a spy, that could be a problem. I mean, recently the Prime Minister did talk about the new Lawrences, and I thought, well, thank goodness he's talking about the new Lawrences and he's not talking about the new Gertrudes, because, you know, that would have been a problem for me, probably.
Well, actually, in Iraq, they do the new, let's say, the new generation and so on. They count her as a spy.
Yes,
You
well,
know,
I think she
however you
was
talk
there.
to them.
But I think she was when it came to the actual Middle East, wasn't she? I don't think.
And she was a consultant to the High Commissioner. I mean, if you count that as a spy.
Well, this is it. I mean, in the end, it comes down to, because I mean, a lot of journalism, I mean, we say it's journalism, but sometimes, I mean, you could perceive that as spying. I mean, in those days, there was no information, so anyone who's passing information on, I suppose, in a way, is spying. But I think it's easier to call her a spy after the First World War, during the war and after, than before, really. I mean, when she was at Ephesus, she clearly wasn't a spy. She was just a tourist.
You could call her an intelligence gatherer.
An intelligence gatherer. Yes, that's fair enough, I think, yes. I mean, well, I will just say about Seljuk that you can actually see the remains of one of the hotels that was there, and there's a picture inside of the man who used to greet people there. And he just looks like this huge Billy Bunter man, a huge man, who, you know, showed Gertrude round and so on, and probably said, don't climb over the bit of wall that fell down because there's no path.
Did you visit Osman Hamdi's museum?
I have done in the past.
Yeah.
Most of these places I'd visited in the past, but I went back for the purposes of this trip, and I will go back again for purposes of this. Well, what's very interesting is that although we know where he lived in Istanbul itself, at Kuru Çeşme, it is apparently not possible to identify exactly the spot of his house, which seems just, how do these things vanish? How is it lost, that knowledge? Somebody said there's so many yalas, they all look the same, and the photographs are from the water. You can't tell which one is his.
His son is my grandmother's friend.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Where, of course, the Whittles were as well in Moda. Yes. Yeah.